I woke up to a sentence I never thought I'd have to say out loud. I was locked out of my own house, and by noon, the people inside would be begging me to let them leave. At the time, I didn't know how that second part would happen yet, only that something was very wrong the moment my key didn't turn the lock. I remember the exact sound it made, a dull, final click that wasn't mine. I stood there in my robe, barefoot on cold concrete, staring at a front door I had walked through every day for 31 years, and for the first time, it didn't recognize me. I tried again, slower this time, like maybe I had made a mistake. The key slid in, but it wouldn't move. That's when I noticed the scratch marks around the knob, fresh, careless, like someone had been in a hurry. Someone had changed the locks while I was asleep inside that house. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 72 years old, and I built that home with my husband before most of the houses on our street even existed. We picked out the hardwood floors together, argued over the kitchen cabinets, planted the maple tree that still shades the driveway every summer. Every inch of that place held a memory, and every memory had my name on it. Or at least, that's what I believed until that morning. I didn't pound on the door. I didn't call out. I just stood there, listening. And that's when I heard it, footsteps inside, calm, unhurried, like whoever was in there felt completely at home. I knew those footsteps. I had heard them for decades. My son, Ryan. A second voice followed, lighter, sharper. Ashley, his wife. I could almost picture her standing in my kitchen, probably holding one of my coffee mugs like it already belonged to her. I stayed quiet. I didn't want them to know I was outside yet. Not because I was afraid, but because something in my chest had gone very still, very clear. People don't change locks by accident. They don't do it overnight without a plan. This wasn't confusion. This was intention. I looked down at the key in my hand, the one my husband had copied at a hardware store 20 years ago, the one that had never failed me until now. It felt lighter than it should have. Useless. That's when Ashley's voice drifted closer to the door. "We should get someone to look at the back patio today," she said, casual, like she was scheduling a routine upgrade. "If we're going to list this place, it needs to show well." List this place. My place. I closed my eyes for a second, just long enough to let the words settle. They weren't just inside my house. They were already planning its future without me. I should have been angry. I should have shouted, demanded answers, called the police right then. But I didn't. Because anger is loud, and loud people lose control. I had spent too many years learning how to survive quietly to waste that now. Instead, I took a step back from the door. Then another. I slipped my useless key into my pocket like it still mattered. And under the weight of everything they thought they had already taken from me, I made a decision they would never see coming. I wasn't going to fight them for that house. Not the way they expected. Because there was something inside those walls they didn't understand yet. Something they had no right to touch. And by the time the sun finished rising over that street, I was going to make sure they learned exactly what that meant. I walked away from the front door without making a sound, even though every instinct in my body was telling me to turn back and demand an explanation. But I had learned something over the years that people like Ryan and Ashley always underestimate. They think silence means weakness. They think if you are not shouting, you are not thinking, and they could not have been more wrong, because by the time I reached the end of the driveway, I was already putting the pieces together, not emotionally, but logically, step by step, like I had done every time life tried to corner me before. I knew they did not just wake up that morning and decide to change the locks. This had been planned, discussed, agreed upon. Probably over dinners where they smiled at me across the table while already imagining me gone. And that told me something important. If they had planned this carefully, then they believed they were protected. They believed they had the right to do it, or at least that I would not be able to stop them. And that belief was their first mistake. I reached my car, opened the door, and sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, not starting the engine, just breathing, just thinking. Because I needed to be certain before I made my next move. Inside that house, they thought they had control because they had the keys, but keys are only symbols. They open doors, they create the illusion of ownership, but they are not ownership itself, and that distinction is where everything begins to change. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling past Ryan's name without hesitation, because calling him would only give him time to prepare, to adjust the story. To try to convince me that this was somehow for my own good, I had heard that tone before, that careful blend of concern and control, and I was not interested in hearing it again. Instead, I opened my contacts and stopped on a name I had not needed in years: Daniel Harper, my attorney, the man who had sat across from me at a polished oak desk 3 summers ago while I made a decision that even Ryan never fully understood. I could still hear Daniel's voice from that day, calm, precise, asking me twice if I was absolutely certain, and I had told him yes both times, because I had seen something even then. Small changes in the way Ashley looked at the house, the way she asked questions about value, about taxes, about long-term plans, questions that sounded casual but were anything but. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear, and when Daniel answered, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I said his name, and then I told him exactly what had just happened. Every detail, the lock, the voices, the word listing, and there was a pause on the other end of the line. Not surprise, but recognition, the kind that comes when a situation unfolds exactly the way it was anticipated. Margaret, he said quietly, do not go back inside. Do not confront them. Just come to my office. Bring everything you have, and I will handle the rest. I ended the call and finally started the engine, and as I pulled away from the curb, I looked at the house one more time in the rearview mirror, the windows catching the early morning light like nothing had changed, like everything inside was exactly as it should be. But I knew better now, because by the time the clock reached noon, they would understand something they had completely overlooked. They had taken the keys while I was asleep, but they had no idea what I had already secured while I was wide awake. I had not always been the kind of woman who called a lawyer before calling her own son, but life has a way of teaching you patterns if you are willing to see them, and Ryan's pattern did not start that morning. It started years ago, quietly, in ways that were easy to excuse at first. I remember the first time Ashley walked through my front door. She smiled, complimented the kitchen, asked polite questions, but her eyes lingered too long on things that were not hers: the layout, the size of the lot, the condition of the roof, details most people would not notice unless they were measuring something in their mind. I told myself she was just curious, just trying to understand the family she had married into, and for a while I chose to believe that. Because believing anything else would have meant questioning my own son's judgment, and I was not ready to do that. Not then, not yet. After my husband passed, the house became quieter, but it also became heavier. Every room held echoes of conversations that would never happen again, and Ryan started coming by more often. At first it felt like comfort, like he was stepping up, checking on me, making sure I was not alone. But over time, the questions changed. They became less about how I was doing and more about what I was planning. Mom, have you thought about downsizing? Mom, this place is a lot to maintain. Mom, what is your long-term plan for the property? They said it gently, always gently, like they were helping me think ahead, but I could hear the direction they were pushing. I just was not ready to admit it out loud. I remember one Sunday afternoon, Ashley standing in the backyard, looking at the fence line like she was already redesigning it. She said something about how the space could be opened up, modernized, made more appealing if it ever went on the market, and I asked her why she was thinking about selling a house that was not hers. She laughed, soft, dismissive, and said she was just speaking in general. But there was nothing general about the way she said it. That was the moment I stopped assuming and started preparing, not dramatically, not emotionally, just quietly, the same way I had handled every difficult chapter in my life. I made an appointment with Daniel Harper, and I sat across from him in that office, hands folded, voice steady, and I told him I wanted to make sure my home would be protected no matter what happened to me. He asked careful questions, explained options, trusts, ownership structures, legal boundaries that most people never think about until it is too late, and I listened to every word, not because I expected a problem, but because I had learned not to ignore the early signs of one. We spent hours going through documents, revising details, placing safeguards in positions that would only matter if someone tried to cross a line they were not supposed to cross, and when I signed those papers, I felt something shift. Not fear, not anger, just clarity. I did not tell Ryan everything. Not because I wanted to hide something from him, but because some protections only work if the people they are meant to protect against do not see them coming, and as I drove toward Daniel's office that morning, the sun rising over Nevada in that quiet, steady way it always does, I realized that everything they had done while I was asleep had already been accounted for long before they ever touched that lock. Daniel's office smelled exactly the same as it had 3 summers ago: polished wood, paper, and something steady that made people tell the truth whether they meant to or not, and when I walked in, he was already standing by his desk with a folder in his hand like he had been expecting this moment long before I ever picked up the phone. I did not sit right away. I just placed my purse on the table and looked at him, and he gave me a small nod. The kind that says you were right without needing to say the words out loud. I told him what I had heard that morning, every detail, the voices, the plan to list the house, the way Ashley said it like she was already living in a future that did not include me, and Daniel listened without interrupting, just like he always did. His expression calm but focused, and when I finished, he opened the folder slowly and turned it toward me. Inside were copies of documents I had signed, documents I remembered clearly, even if no one else in my family knew they existed. He tapped the top page with his finger and said, "Margaret, they may have the keys, but they do not have the authority, and that is the difference that matters." I looked down at the paper, my name printed exactly where it should be, along with language that most people would have skipped over without understanding, but I had not skipped it. I had read every line back then, because something inside me had insisted that one day it might matter. Daniel continued, explaining it again. Not because I did not understand, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way nothing else could. The property was no longer held the way Ryan believed it was. The structure had changed, legally, quietly, in a way that prevented exactly what they were trying to do. No sale could happen without conditions they could not meet. No transfer could be completed without approvals they did not have, and most importantly, any attempt to force control without proper authority would put them in a position they would not be able to defend. I felt something settle inside me then, not relief, not satisfaction, just a steady certainty that I was not standing outside that house powerless like they thought. I was standing outside by choice. Daniel closed the folder and looked at me carefully. "We can act now," he said, "but I need you to understand something. Once we move forward, this does not stay private. There will be consequences, not just legal ones, but personal ones," and I knew exactly what he meant, because this was not just about a house anymore. This was about a line that had been crossed without hesitation. I nodded once, because I had already made that decision the moment I heard Ashley say the word list, and Daniel picked up his phone, made a call, spoke in that same calm, precise tone that carried weight without needing volume, arranging what needed to be arranged, setting things in motion that Ryan and Ashley would not see coming until it was already happening. When he hung up, he looked back at me and said, "They think they locked you out, Margaret, but what they really did was step into a situation they do not control." And for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to take a breath that felt complete, because I knew something they did not. The house they were standing in was not the advantage they believed it was. It was the very thing that was about to turn against them. We did not go back to the house right away, and that was intentional, because timing matters more than emotion in situations like this, and Daniel understood that better than anyone. He had already coordinated with the county office and a local enforcement officer who specialized in property disputes, not because there was violence, but because there needed to be clarity, legal clarity. The kind that leaves no room for interpretation or excuses. By the time we left his office, the sun was fully up, casting that bright Nevada light across everything like it was exposing truths people would rather keep hidden, and I sat in the passenger seat of his car, watching the streets pass by, not nervous, not angry, just aware that the next time I saw my front door, It would not be as a woman asking to be let back in, it would be as the rightful authority returning to enforce what had already been decided long before that morning. When we pulled into my driveway, there were already signs that Ryan and Ashley had moved quickly. A contractor truck parked along the curb, the back gate slightly open, footprints in the gravel where there had been none the day before. They were not waiting, they were acting, as if speed could replace permission. Daniel stepped out first, calm as ever, carrying the folder, and I followed a few steps behind, not rushing, not hesitating, just walking toward the same front door that had refused me hours earlier. This time, there was no need for my key. Because Daniel knocked. Firmly, once, twice, not aggressively, just enough to announce presence, and inside, I heard movement again. Quicker this time, less confident. The door opened, and there they were. Ryan standing slightly in front of Ashley like he thought positioning could somehow give him control of the situation. His expression shifting the moment he saw me. Confusion first, then irritation. And finally something closer to concern when his eyes moved to Daniel, who did not introduce himself with unnecessary words. He simply stated his name, his role, and the purpose of our visit, clear, direct, impossible to misunderstand. Ryan tried to speak over him at first, something about a misunderstanding, about helping me, about how they thought it was best. The same phrases people use when they know they have crossed a line but still believe they can talk their way back across it. Ashley stood just behind him, arms folded, her expression tighter than it had been that morning. No smile now, no softness. Just calculation. But calculation only works when you have the right information, and they did not. Daniel opened the folder and held it steady. Not dramatic, not forceful, just present, and he explained, step by step, what their actions meant in legal terms, what authority they did not have, what consequences were already in motion. And as he spoke, I watched Ryan's face change again, the confidence draining in small, almost invisible increments. Because this was no longer a conversation between family members, this was a structure they had stepped into without understanding it. Ashley tried to interrupt, asking about ownership, about rights, about what they were allowed to do, but Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply pointed to the document, the one I had signed years ago, the one that defined everything they thought they already controlled, and in that moment, standing in the doorway of a house they believed they had taken, they began to realize something they had not considered when they changed those locks. They had not secured anything, they had exposed themselves, and I did not need to say a single word for that realization to begin settling in. The silence that followed. Daniel's explanation was different from anything I had experienced with Ryan before. It was not the silence of a disagreement waiting to escalate, it was the silence of realization. The kind that settles slowly but completely when the facts do not leave room for argument. Ryan looked from the document to me, then back to Daniel, as if repeating the motion might somehow change what he was seeing, but nothing changed. The words were still there. The structure was still intact, and the authority they thought they had simply was not theirs to claim. Ashley stepped forward then, her voice sharper now, less controlled, asking questions faster than Daniel needed to answer them, trying to find a gap, a technicality, something she could use to reframe the situation in their favor, but there was nothing there for her to hold on to, because this had not been prepared overnight. It had been built carefully, piece by piece, long before they ever decided to act. I remained where I was. Just outside the threshold, not stepping in, not reclaiming space physically, because this was not about walking back into a room, it was about reestablishing something much deeper, something they had tried to bypass entirely. Ryan finally spoke, his voice lower now, less certain, asking why I had not told him, why I had not trusted him with this information, and for the first time that morning, I answered, not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. I told him that trust is not something you explain in advance, it is something people reveal through their actions, and his actions had answered that question for me long before this day. He did not respond right away, and that pause said more than anything he could have argued. Daniel then outlined the next steps, not as threats, but as procedures. What would happen if they remained in the house without proper authorization? What documentation had already been filed? what timeline they were now operating under, whether they accepted it or not. The contractor outside had stopped moving by then, standing near the truck, watching just enough to understand that something had shifted, because even from a distance, you can recognize when control changes. Hands. Ashley tried one more time, asking if there was a way to resolve this privately, to keep it within the family. But Daniel's response was simple. This had already gone beyond that point the moment they took action without authority, and the process would move forward accordingly. I watched their expressions as that reality settled in, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet confirmation that what I had sensed years ago had been accurate. This was never about helping me. It was about positioning themselves, and now that position had collapsed under its own assumption. I took a step closer to the doorway then, not crossing it, just enough to meet Ryan's eyes without distance between us, and I told him something I had not said in a long time. I said that I had never intended to keep him out of anything that mattered, but I would not remain in a place where I was treated like I no longer belonged, and that decision did not start today. It had simply become visible today. He nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding that the moment had already passed where things could be undone with a conversation, and as Daniel closed the folder and prepared to move the process forward, I realized that everything inside that house, every object, every memory, every piece of it, was no longer something I needed to fight for, because the real shift had already happened, and it was not about possession. It was about standing in a position where I no longer had to accept being pushed out of my own life. What happened next did not happen all at once, and that was the part they had not prepared for, because people who act quickly to take control usually expect everything else to move quickly in response. But the law does not move like emotion. It moves in sequence, and Daniel made that very clear as he stepped slightly forward and handed Ryan a formal notice, not with force, not with drama, just with the quiet certainty of something that had already been set in motion. Ryan took it slowly, like the paper itself carried more weight than it should, his eyes scanning the lines, trying to understand where exactly things had turned against him, and Ashley leaned in closer, reading over his shoulder, her expression tightening further with every sentence, because this was not a conversation anymore. This was documentation, and documentation does not change based on how you feel about it. Daniel explained that their presence inside the property, under the current legal structure, was not recognized as ownership or control, and any attempt to alter, sell, or represent the property as theirs could trigger consequences they would not be able to reverse easily. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because clarity does more than volume ever could. I watched Ryan's hands as he held the notice. They were not shaking, but they were not steady either. And that told me everything I needed to know about where he stood in that moment, caught between what he believed and what he was now being forced to accept. Ashley tried to speak again, asking what options they had, asking how this could be resolved without escalating further, but Daniel's response remained consistent. The process had already begun, and their cooperation would determine how smoothly it moved forward, but it would move forward regardless. I stepped back then, giving space not because I needed it, but because the focus was no longer on me standing outside that door. It was on them standing inside something they could not hold on to. The contractor outside started his engine, then turned it off again, unsure whether to stay or leave. Because even from a distance, the shift in authority was visible. Ryan finally looked up at me again, and this time there was no argument in his expression, only a question he did not fully know how to ask, and I understood it without him saying a word. He was trying to figure out when this had become irreversible, when the moment passed where things could have been handled differently, and the truth was simple. It had passed long before today. It had passed the first time they chose action without conversation. The first time they decided access meant ownership. The first time they believed I would not respond. Daniel closed the folder once more and made it clear what would happen next. There would be a formal timeline, a requirement for them to vacate under the proper conditions, and oversight to ensure everything was handled according to the structure already in place. There was no urgency in his tone, but there was no flexibility either. And that combination left no space for misunderstanding. I turned slightly, looking at the house not as something taken from me, but as something that had revealed the truth I needed to see, and for the first time that morning, I realized something that surprised even me. I was not thinking about going back inside right away, because what mattered had already been reclaimed. Not the walls, not the rooms, but the position I had refused to give up, and as the process continued to unfold exactly as it was designed to, Ryan and Ashley stood there holding a reality they could not undo, and understanding, finally, that the door they had closed on me was not the one that decided how this story would end. By the time the next hour passed, everything had shifted from possibility into process, and process has a way of stripping away illusion faster than any argument ever could. A county officer arrived not with urgency, but with purpose. The kind of presence that does not escalate a situation, but makes it clear that it has already been defined. He greeted Daniel with a brief nod, then asked a few direct questions, confirming what had already been documented. And Ryan stood there trying to follow along, trying to keep up with a structure he had never taken the time to understand. Ashley remained close to him, quieter now, watching carefully, calculating again, but with fewer options available than before. The officer explained what would happen next. Not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a procedure that had already been triggered the moment they acted without authority. They would need to vacate under the conditions outlined. There would be a timeline, there would be oversight, and anything that had been altered without proper rights would need to be addressed accordingly. There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation, just the steady movement of something that had already been decided. I stayed where I was, a few steps back from the doorway, listening but not intervening, because this was not my moment to argue or explain. It was my moment to witness the reality unfold exactly as it had been built to. Ryan tried one last time to reframe it, saying they were only trying to help, that they thought this was what I needed, but even as he said the words, they did not hold the same weight they might have earlier, because now they were being measured against action, not intention, and action has a way of revealing truth without needing interpretation. Ashley asked about retrieving their belongings, about how much time they had, her voice controlled again but no longer confident, and Daniel answered with the same clarity he had maintained from the beginning, outlining the steps, the timing, the expectations, everything precise, everything documented, nothing left open for misunderstanding. The contractor quietly started packing up tools without being told, recognizing that whatever had been planned for that day was no longer moving forward, and as I watched them begin to step back from something they thought they had already secured, I realized that the shift was complete, not because they were leaving the house, but because they were finally seeing it for what it actually was. Not an opportunity, not an asset they could take control of, but a boundary they had crossed without understanding. I took a few steps forward then, not to reclaim the space physically, but to stand at the threshold where everything had changed, and Ryan looked at me again, this time without defense, without explanation, just a quiet recognition that things were not going back to what they were, and I did not need to say much, because the moment did not require it. I simply told him that what mattered was not the house itself, it was the way it had been treated, and that once that line was crossed, it could not be ignored or undone. He nodded slowly, and for the first time, there was no attempt to argue. No attempt to correct. Just acceptance of something that had already taken shape. The officer confirmed the next steps once more. Daniel closed the folder, and as the process continued forward exactly as it was meant to, I stood there knowing that everything inside those walls had already been settled long before they ever thought they could take it, and now, standing in the open light of the morning, they were finally beginning to understand why. By late afternoon, the house was quiet again, not empty, but settled in a way it had not been that morning, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been corrected, not erased, just placed back into its proper position. Ryan and Ashley had gathered what they needed under the conditions laid out for them, moving through the rooms with a careful awareness that had not been there before, no longer acting like owners, no longer making plans out loud, just following instructions, and I watched from a distance at first, not because I was avoiding it, but because I did not need to stand in every space to know what it meant. Daniel remained nearby, ensuring everything moved according to what had already been set in motion. And the officer returned briefly to confirm compliance. Nothing dramatic, nothing raised, just the steady completion of a process that had already reached its conclusion when they finally stepped out through the front door, carrying the last of their things. Ryan paused for a moment on the walkway, looking back at the house, then at me, and for a second, I saw something familiar in his expression. Not the confidence from before, not the frustration from earlier, but something quieter. Something closer to recognition, like he was seeing not just what had happened today, but what had led up to it. I walked forward then, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to stand where we could speak without distance. And he opened his mouth like he was about to explain, but I shook my head slightly, not to stop him completely, just to make it clear that explanations were no longer necessary, because this was not a moment that needed to be rewritten with better words. It was a moment that needed to be understood for what it already was. I told him that I had spent years building that house, not just with money, but with time, with patience, with decisions made carefully and intentionally, and that I had never expected to defend it from my own family, but that expectation did not change the reality of what had happened. He nodded once, and this time there was no resistance in it, no attempt to shift responsibility, just acceptance. Ashley stood a few steps behind him, quieter than I had ever seen her, not speaking, not interrupting, just listening, and I realized then that the lesson they were taking from this would not come from anything I said next. It would come from everything that had already unfolded. I stepped past them and toward the door, reaching into my purse, not for the old key, but for something else, a small envelope Daniel had given me earlier that day. Inside it was the new access, the one aligned with the structure that had protected everything when it mattered. I opened the door without hesitation this time, the lock responding exactly as it should, and as I stepped inside, I did not rush to look around. I did not check every room, because I already knew what was there, what had always been there. What had never actually been taken. I turned back briefly, meeting Ryan's eyes one last time, and I told him something simple, something that did not need to be repeated, that I did not lose anything today. I only stopped pretending that I had to accept being treated like I did not belong. He did not respond, and that was fine, because understanding does not always require an answer. Sometimes it just requires time. The door closed gently behind me. Not as a barrier, not as a punishment, but as a boundary, and for the first time in a long time, I stood in my own home not thinking about who might try to take it, but knowing exactly what I would never allow again, and that was something no one could lock me out of.